A little intro. This came about because the ministry team actually, we had quite a few people who were interested in learning more about what it means to be Baptist. Some people knew what it meant to be Baptist in some context, but what does it mean to be American Baptist? And other folks had no experience with Baptist at all anyways, and just wanted to know, what does that mean? Um, and I'll say on a personal note that I, really felt like I came home to being Baptist when I was in seminary and took some classes, some Baptist classes. But recently, being in the living school, I am always hearing Richard Rohr talk, and Richard Rohr loves that he's Franciscan, and he talks all the time about being Franciscan, but in a way that doesn't make me feel like he wants me to become Franciscan. He just has a deep appreciation for his tradition, and I thought, we have this rich tradition as well, being Baptist, that I'm really proud of, and I'm glad that we get an opportunity now to talk about that as a church. So let me open us in prayer, and then I will hand it off to our speaker tonight, Slayden Yarbrough. So please join me in prayer. God, it is so wonderful to see the diversity that exists in the world, from the diversity of creation, of flowers, of animals, of people, of cultures, to the creativity and diversity that people display through art and through lifestyle and through all kinds of mediums. And another place that we can look as Christians at diversity is the diversity of denominations. And I think when we look at it as kind of a kaleidoscope versus some kind of divisive understanding, we can see that there's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of beauty in the ways that different denominations interpret scripture, the way they emphasize different things, the way they structure their communal life together. And this is something that I find really fascinating and, again, beautiful. But at the end of the day, while the other ones are beautiful, I have found my home with the Baptist, as many of us have. And so I am excited for us to dive into this series and learn about what it means to be Baptist. I'm thankful for those who came before us and paved the way. I'm thankful for everyone here. I'm thankful for our speakers, and I pray that you would just deepen our faith as we kind of learn more and more about our identity as a Baptist church. So please be with Slayden. Bless him. Bless our time together. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Not too long ago, several months back, I read a statement from Bill Leonard, one of my favorite people, a guy I've gotten to know fairly well. And he said, being Baptist is messy. And I think he's right when you look at, if you know the Baptist history to any degree. It reminded me of a statement I heard about the church that I think fits Baptist quite well, at least in my experience. And so I'll say Baptist instead of the church. And basically, it goes something like this, is that, let's see if I can get started on it. Being Baptist is like Noah's Ark. If it weren't for the storm on the outside, you couldn't stand the smell on the inside. And yet, when I look at that, I think Carla must be able to hear it because she's laughing at that. All right. But when you look at that, in a sense, it helps to define Baptist because of our strong emphasis when we practice it. Baptist freedom leads to diversity, it leads to conflict, it leads to fights, and it leads to growth. And so I think, in a sense, that if we were just someone other than Baptists, our lives might be dull and boring. We might be told what we do, how we practice, how we worship, our theology. I'm sure that's simplistic, but I think being Baptist, if we follow the basic principles, it's going to be fun, and it's going to, I think, open ourselves up to, I like to use the term, meaningful dialogue with one another. My first introduction to Baptist history came when my pastor in the Southern Baptist Church back in Washington Park, Illinois, gave me a small pamphlet. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's called The Trail of Blood. And it was written by a fellow named J.M. Carroll, who happened to be the first president of Oklahoma Baptist University, where I taught. And he went back and tried to trace the origin of Baptists all the way back to the beginning in an unbroken line. And I don't know if you can see this, but he had a chart of church history. And in that chart, there, let's see if I can get that up fairly well. In that chart, there are a lot of little red dots. And he says, whether you call them that or not, these are Baptists, and we've been around all the time from the very beginning. And he traced it all the way up through the Reformation. The black stuff and the black lettering, that's the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and all the others. But that was my introduction. It wasn't very good. It was a fallacious history I discovered later on, but at least it said, you know, we do have a history. I want to begin tonight by talking about the name Baptist. And when we think about the name Baptist, we weren't always called Baptists. We didn't call ourselves that. We had in the early years of the Baptist movement, we would call ourselves simply the Church or the Church of Christ, not the denominational factor, of course. The Church of Christ gathered at some particular place. Sometimes the early Baptists referred to themselves as baptizing churches. It wasn't until probably in the 1640s that we began to kind of use the term in reference to a Baptist church. We had a couple of confessions of faith, the First London Confession of 1644, and it referred to baptized congregations. In 1644 also, we began to be nicknamed Baptists. And that's because we baptized by immersion out in rivers and in lakes. Those early churches will not have had baptistries because baptism was done by infant baptism along the way. So anyway, the name didn't come along until later, and it actually started out as a nickname for us. But I think over the years, at least when we've been our best, we've taken a lot of pride in being Baptists, sometimes too much along the way. I want to follow this up by talking about some views of the origin of Baptists. Where did we come from? And some of you who've had courses in Baptist history or maybe read Robert Torbett's History of the Baptists may be familiar with some of these things. And I showed you the little book, The Trail of Blood. This is based upon a view that's called the successionist view, or the JJJ, John Jerusalem Jordan, you know, that the beginning of Baptist was when John baptized Jesus in the Jordan River, you know. And so it's a view that says that we can trace an unbroken historical tradition of Baptists all the way back to the time of Jesus. And the unbroken historical interpretation of both of those two terms, unbroken and historical, that we have been around all along. They started with a couple of premises, those who held to this view. One view, and it's called the successionist view, one view says that the only true churches, notice the plural, the only true churches are Baptist churches. All the others, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, they are religious societies because they don't have the truth as the Baptists do. So we were the only true churches. They also use Matthew 16:18 when Jesus at Caesarea Philippi asked his disciples, "Who am I?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ." And Jesus says, Peter, or you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And so they were saying that there Jesus guaranteed the perpetuity of his church. We would always be around. And so if the only true churches are Baptist churches and Jesus guaranteed the perpetuity of his church, the continuation of his church, then the logical conclusion is that we can trace ourselves all the way back to the time of Jesus in an unbroken historical succession. Now, once they had that theory in place, they kind of began to look for evidence. It's called a priori reasoning, David. You may be familiar with that. You start out with the truth, and then you try to find some evidence to prove it. And these people, they found groups back there that practice baptism for believers sometimes by immersion. And they said, there's a Baptist church. They may not call themselves that, but there's the evidence we need. The problem was they took a lot of movements that they held some positions that were not really Baptist, at least in my mind. There was a group called the Cathari, came out of, you know, as you're nearing the Reformation, it was a reforming type group. And the Cathari, they said they held a believer's baptism, but they also held to what is called the fast of Endura. And that was when you reached a certain age, older in years, you kind of reach a stage of perfection, and then you just stopped eating and you died. You know, it was kind of a fast right there at the end when you'd reach perfection along the way. Jeremy, we used to call that pastor salary, you know, on that particular part. But anyway, they held it. And one other view they had that I have not heard a lot of sermons in Baptist churches. I think David may have done this at one time, but it said that at the divine conception, the Holy Spirit entered the left ear of Mary. That looks like my right ear, but it's the left ear on the other way. I haven't preached many sermons on that, and I don't think anyone else has. So we would start out and we had a view and we tried to prove it. And the historians, for the most part, have rejected this. But that was my beginning. That was the first orientation I had. A second view, kind of like the idea of some continuity back with the apostolic period, and it was called the continuation of biblical teachings. And this were those who said, no, we can't prove an unbroken succession, but there have been basic teachings that are a part of the Baptist heritage, basic principles, and they've been around all along, whether we can trace a historical succession or not. And that kind of comforted some people in the process. A couple other people, let's see, Thomas Crosby, he was an English Baptist historian. He said it's been kind of a spiritual succession along the way. It's not based upon history as much as it is kind of concepts and ideas and principles. Another view, and I'm getting the outline from Leon Macbeth, a good friend of mine and a Baptist historian. Although I taught the Torbit view for many years, I used to use Torbit's view even in a Southern Baptist school. I used his History of the Baptists as a textbook. But the succession view was divided up into the Anabaptist influence theory. And I really like Torbit's name. If any of you remember this, he called it the Anabaptist spiritual kinship theory. I love that, the Anabaptist spiritual kinship theory. If we had a youth organizations at choir, maybe the Anabaptist spiritual kinship singers, that would do it for me. I'd go listen to them anytime, whether they could sing or not. But this says that Baptists can trace themselves back to a group that came out of the Reformation, and it was the first stage of the Reformation, along with Lutheranism and Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, called the Reformed tradition. There was also a left-wing movement of the Reformation called the Anabaptists. And again, that was a nickname. It's not the anti-Baptist, it's the Anabaptists, and it means rebaptizers. And their opponents said, you're rebaptizing. They were baptizing believers, and they rejected the idea of a second baptism. But their opponent said you're baptized as infants, now you're baptized as believers. That's the second baptism. So they were called rebaptizers by their enemies. When I used to lecture, I kind of threw in a third baptism that has a little bit of validity, because especially in Zurich during the time of Zwingli, these radicals were considered heretics, and they were drowned in the Lamont River in Zurich. And that made them the third baptism, the martyr's baptism. At least that's the way I lectured at it. But there's a little bit of evidence on that. But they held a lot of views that we as Baptists hold to. And out of this movement came the Mennonites. And I have a strong affinity toward the Mennonites. Good friends of mine. When I got in heretical trouble, a former Mennonite was one of the guys that came to bat for me. But they held to the authority of the scriptures. They held to believers' baptism. They held to separation of church and state and religious liberty. But they also held some other views that were, well, you know, they didn't want you to serve in magisterial position. Baptists had run for office through most of their career. They wanted you to separate from the world, and we've been kind of in the world, or tried to be, but not of the world throughout our history. So there were some things that they had that we do not practice. There has never been a direct link between an Anabaptist church to a Baptist church. So there's not that historical link. And I think that when you talk about the the beginnings of Baptists, the historicity to me is an important factor in all of that. But I really like the Anabaptists, and these were a part of what is called the Radical Reformation, and a part of a group within that called Biblical Radicals in the process. And we will encounter them a little bit when we talk about the English. But that view, there's never been a direct historical link. The final view, and I used to tell my students when I got to this, and said, I would say, and now for God's view concerning where did Baptists begin, because it's a view that I hold. You know, they weren't always pleased with that, but surely if God has a view of the beginning of Baptists, I'm sure he or she would agree with this. That'll get me into trouble there in some old circles. But it's called the English separatist theory, or Torbert called it the English separatist descent theory, that we descended out of a group called the English separatists. You have to go back to the Reformation. The first stage of the Reformation, you had Lutheranism, the Reformed tradition, the Anabaptists. The second stage was the Reformation in England. You probably know the story, actually. Henry VIII at one time was considered a defender of the Catholic faith by the Pope when he wrote a work against Luther, or someone wrote it for him and he signed it. But then he decided along the way that he wanted to get rid of his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Mary Anne Boleyn, who I think in New Testament or biblical language was heavy with child, if I remember correctly. So anyway, he got into trouble at that time, and basically, the Pope normally could have annulled the marriage with Catherine of Aragon from Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were her parents, and her uncle was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and that complicated things. But he couldn't do that because Charles V put pressure upon the Pope at that particular time. And so the Church of England actually just separated from the Catholic Church. So the Reformation was not based upon theology or ecclesiology. It was based upon the need for Henry to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, who became the mother, who was the mother of Mary. It all ties into a lot of things. So the English separatists would come out of a movement that developed within that. Elizabeth was the third child to assume the throne after Henry. His only son, Edward VI, was only 9. There was a regency. He died sickly, I don't know, a few years later. And then Mary was Catholic. She came in, and you've heard of Bloody Mary, you know, a great deal of persecution. Fox's Book of Martyrs has lots of stories about that. And when she died, then Elizabeth became queen in 1558 or 1559 and remained so until 1603. She had an English settlement, they called it. And basically, if you held to the 39 articles in the Common Book of Prayer, you had a lot of flexibility in your beliefs. Well, there were some within the church who felt like the reforms needed to be greater. They were called Puritans. They wanted to purify the church, and they wanted their form of Puritanism to be the established church in England. They would probably hold to Presbyterial polity. Most of them would be Calvinists in theology. In that movement, there arose a group called English separatists. They held a congregational church government. They wanted to separate from the Church of England. And so they were the English separatists. And out of that group came the English Baptists as such. There was a group of English separatists in a place called Scrooby, Gainsborough. 2 locations, 1 church. The Scrooby group became the Pilgrim Fathers that we're familiar with, made their way to Plymouth, or at least a minority of that group. And the other group at Gainsborough under John Smythe, during the time of James I, Elizabeth had died in 1603, but he promised to harry out of the land, you know, those who were dissenters. And so these Baptists, the trip was paid for by Thomas Helwys. They left England. Their pastor was John Smythe. And somewhere around 1608, they arrived in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, they were of the Reformed tradition, the Calvinistic tradition, their church was, but they had suffered so greatly during the Inquisition that they were a tolerant people and allowed others to come in and practice their faith. And so they went there, and they were separatists. The separatists formed a church based upon the covenant. They made a covenant with God and with one another, and that's the way they established a church. Somewhere early in the process, Smythe, in studying the scriptures, came to the conclusion that baptism was for believers. And so out of this came the first Baptist church. Basically, baptism was not by immersion at this time. It was by effusion or pouring. And so Smythe, took either a handful, cupped a handful of water and poured over his head, or took maybe a cup of water and poured over his head and baptized himself. He was called the Say Baptist, the Self-Baptist. And then he baptized, I think, 38 others, I believe. And that's the first Baptist church. They didn't call themselves Baptists. Also, they were Arminian in theology. I don't know if you know much about Arminianism. Some of you do. But Jacob Arminius, he, I think, had broke from Calvinism, and he stressed free will. And basically, the view that sticks with these Baptists is the idea that Christ, when he died he died for everyone. He did not just die for the elect like the Calvinistic group would do. What happens, at the death of Christ, and so it's the atonement. That's a theological term we use. You all are familiar with that. But in the atonement, there was a general atonement, and Smythe accepted this view. He said that God foreknew who would be saved, but he didn't elect or predestine anyone to be saved. And so everyone could be saved, but those who had faith in Christ could. He also said you could fall from grace, and that would cause meaningful dialogue with other Baptists in the world that I grew up in. But they were called the General Baptists. A couple of things that developed out of this process that I think are important, and I won't jump into it too far because some of you down the road may spend more time with this, although I could. I've been known to do that. But they wrote confessions of faith. They expressed themselves. Very early on, this church wrote a confession of faith. A confession is a statement that says, this we believe. It's not a creed. A creed says, this you must believe. But a confession, this we believe. And it usually had some statement in the preface that acknowledged the right of any group of Baptists, whether it be individual churches or groups of churches along the way, that they had a right to express themselves theologically and confessionally. So they wrote confessions of faith. Somewhere early on, Smythe reached the conclusion that his baptism was not valid. He was kind of convinced that he was convinced that you could form a church on believers' baptism if there was no other church around that practiced it. But then he found out there was a group called the Waterlander Mennonites, and they practiced believers' baptism. So he and, let's see, I guess that he and most of his church decided to try to join the Waterlander Mennonites. He never got in. He died in 1612, I think, tuberculosis maybe. And then in 1615, the rest of the group was accepted, except for Thomas Helwys. This was the rich businessman who had paid for the journey over, and 10 others. They remained and considered themselves the true church. They published their confession of faith at that time. One of the things that came out of this, Helwys and his church became convinced that every person ought to be able to worship God in their homeland freely, without persecution. And so they went back to a place called Spitalfield, which is across the Thames River from London. And there they established the first Baptist church on English soil, or they'd established it. They, I guess, instituted it on English soil. One of the things that Helwys is noted for, and he's one of my real heroes, he wrote in 1612 a work entitled The Mystery of Iniquity. That's a phrase out of Revelation. And in that, he said, whether he be heretic, Turk, that's Muslim, Jew, and then in case he left anyone out, he added, or whatsoever, it's no business of the civil magistrates of the king to punish anyone for their religious convictions. And most people, including myself, believe that this is the first statement in English calling for complete liberty of conscience, complete religious liberty. And out of that, of course, the other side of that coin would be separation of church and state. He was arrested. He was thrown into the Newgate prison. And by 1616, he died. We don't know exactly when or how. But I think, at least in his heart and in his spirit, he died a free man because he went back to England and he worshiped God and he paid the consequences for it. But this is one line, this is one phase of the English Baptist. And we see believers' baptism, not by immersion yet. We see congregational governments, what they had, because they still, I guess, kind of kept their covenant with one another, but the church was established based upon believers' baptism, confessional theology along the way, and then religious liberty and separation of church and state. And that's a really, really great contribution. So that's the English General Baptist. They continued on, and eventually there was kind of a merger of one of their groups with the Particular Baptist. The Particular Baptist also came out of the English separatist movement. There was a man by the name of Henry Jacob. And for a period of time, I was convinced that Henry Jacob was the absolutely most important Christian in the history of Christianity. Now you say, who is he and why would you say that? He's the guy I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. I lived, slept, ate, almost, I didn't die with him, but I could have. But I thought he was important, and I still think he was today, because he actually touched a whole lot of different movements. But Jacob was what I would call a moderate separatist. Many separatists just denied everything from the Church of England. They denied the ministry of the Church of England. They denied the sacraments of the Church of England. They denied the ecclesiology, which was Episcopal ecclesiology of the Church of England. They denied everything. Jacob was much more moderate in his views. He kind of accepted that. He would have in his church people who had been baptized in the Church of England, and that wasn't an issue for himself, or for the others. And so he had a more positive view toward the Church of England. So he was moderate in his positions. He, in fact, I'll point out now, he also wound up going to the colonies, and somewhere died in Virginia, somewhere around Jamestown, I think. But he established a church in England. Let me get my information correct here. I think in Suffolk, England, and try to my date on that. 1616. That's 4 years after the group, the General Baptist group, came to Spitalfield. 1616, he established a church. It was not a Baptist church. It was an independent church. But out of that church, you saw the development of the people called the Particular Baptists, and I'll explain that in just a second. There were 3 pastors during the time in which it moved from where Jacob started them to becoming a Baptist church. Let's see if I lost it. I had something I was going to say on that, so I guess I won't if I can't remember it. That's Gary. That's what happens when you get older than Gary. So one of the things that was important in this church, and it was an independent church, they called it, or congregational, same as the congregational basically in New England. It was an independent church, and they allowed freedom of discussion within that congregation of whatever issues might come up. They had a very, very pleasant attitude. And along the way, they would discuss different issues related to the subject of baptism. Jacob was the first pastor. John Lathrop succeeded him. He also went to New England, I think, later on. And then a fellow named Henry Jesse. So they called it the JLJ Church, the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church. In the process, the first thing they discussed, and it wasn't a big issue in the development of Baptists, but they discussed the administrator, who is a proper administrator of baptism. And some concluded that their baptism in the Church of England was not valid. And they had a discussion, and those that considered it not valid, they left and joined their own movement. Others remained. Then they began to discuss the subject of baptism. And some came to the conclusion that baptism was for believers only. A fellow named John Spilsbury in 1638, with 6 of the members there, left and actually founded their own church. And in that process, it was a very amicable separation. In fact, I think they often, when they had these divisions, they would just kind of meet together and pray and wish each other well and send them on their way. But now you had a group, and I think the Spilsbury Church was probably the first Particular Baptist church. And I'll talk about Particular Baptists in a moment. Then they began to discuss the subject the mode of baptism or the method of baptism. What is the proper way to baptize? And they came to the conclusion that actually baptism should be by total immersion. And no one in England practiced that, but there were some that they knew about in the Netherlands. And they had a fellow named Richard Blunt, and they sent Richard Blunt over to the Netherlands, and he met with this group of Mennonites. They were called the Collegians or the Rijnsburgers, and they practiced believers' baptism by immersion. And a few of the scholars, like Leon Macbeth, I mentioned him earlier, they came to, the scholars, a couple of these scholars came to the conclusion they think that Blunt was baptized by immersion in the Netherlands. And that's how he kind of learned to do it. He came back and he baptized a teacher in the church, and that teacher then baptized, I think, 51 others. And it was by immersion. And what we have here is that in terms of baptism, and that would be 1644, I think that took place, you now had Baptists practicing immersion, baptism immersion of adults. And that's the full 9 yards on that. Also in the Jesse church, it was kind of a mixed church. There were independents, and as people became Baptists, they went ahead and got baptized, but were still a part of the church. And finally, Jesse himself, the pastor, Henry Jesse, he also accepted the Baptist position, and he was baptized. And about that time in 1645, the Suffolk Church, the JLJ Church, became a Baptist church. It was a particular Baptist church. Particular Baptists were Calvinistic Baptists, or the Reformed tradition that came out of Zurich and Geneva. And so they held to a predestinarian view. And when you get the name particular, when you talk about the atonement, it's a particular atonement. Jesus did not die for the whole world. He died for the elect. Liliana, you're shaking your head. I think you've been down this road, haven't you? Or haven't? Anyway, but so they held this view that what happened in the atonement, Jesus died for the elect and the elect only, and you don't waste any of his saving efficiency in the process like that. And it's based upon Calvinistic teaching. And if you want to, you can proof text that. You might even proof text foreknowledge in the place of it. At least I do sometimes. So here you have two groups of Baptists. And one is rooted in the Arminian theological position. The other is rooted in the Calvinistic position. Now, I will say that I don't know if any of you are familiar with Glenn Stassen. Glenn Stassen was an ethicist. Glenn taught at Southern Seminary. Like good Baptists, they had a fight in the school, and he wound up coming out to Golden Gate Seminary. His father ran for president at least twice and maybe 3 times from Kansas. So he was a well-known politician. And I saw Glenn one time, and at the time I was editing Baptist History and Heritage, a journal of the Southern Baptist Historical Society and the Historical Commission, the SBC. And we got to talking. And he has this view that actually the first London Confession of Faith, this was the first major particular Baptist confession of faith. It was in 1644, that has on one hand the roots of Calvinism coming out of the separatist tradition. But it says when he gets to salvation, it seems like he shifts over to writings of Menno Simons, the founder of the Mennonite movement. And he talks about the teachings related to redemption and salvation, and he has quotes directly from that. And so he's saying that group had roots in both the Mennonites, the Arminian tradition, and also in the separatist tradition or the Reformed tradition of the Calvinists. And he had written 2 papers, so I had them published in the Journal of Baptist History and Heritage. And then a friend, let's say, whose father was a Mennonite who may have been, I think he was the editor of a Mennonite quarterly. Anyway, his son told his father about this. His father liked it and wrote and said, can we publish that ourselves? So it wound up in being both a Baptist journal and a Mennonite journal. But you have these 2 different groups. And Bill Leonard, once again, to quote him, he said, we're the only major denomination that is rooted in 2 theological heritages of Arminianism and Calvinism. And so you can kind of almost see that sometimes in our churches. I came out of the Southern Baptist movement, and they didn't stress Calvinism very much. They're doing it today. Their leadership today is strongly Reformed tradition, and they almost split the SBC again after they split it during my last years in it. So we have these roots in two different traditions. And I think it shows you where it can take Baptists. And I find a lot of Baptists, they might talk about being election. You know, I think some of the theologians from Southwestern Seminary would talk about God's election, but on the other hand, turn around and talk about, you know, the need to have faith. And there's kind of a comfortable balance between the two traditions when it comes to that. American Baptists, you know, I think most that I've run into would seem to be more of the Arminian interpretation, at least to some degree. A good friend of mine is a Reformed tradition Baptist that pastored over at Camas. Some of you know him. Darrell Elledge is a strong follower of the Calvinistic tradition, but we have good coffees and lots of good discussions. So you have these movements. Let me say just a few quick summary things, and then you may have some questions on that. What do we get from these early Baptists in England? We get the fact that they adopted believers' baptism, and eventually they moved to immersion as a beautiful symbol of one's faith and one's redemptive experience, and being buried to the old way of life and raised to a new way of life. And so this basic distinctive of who we are as Baptists, it's rooted in both the General Baptist and the Particular Baptist. Congregational church government is important. They got this out of the separatist movement, out of that Reformation phase out of the separatist movement, and yet they learned to work together, and it was basically called associational cooperation. The associations among the General Baptists were actually, they had more authority than they did among the Particular Baptists. We might not be quite as comfortable with them in terms of their views, but they would come together in associations. They would protect the autonomy of the local church. And then you turn around and they wind up at the same time, find that they can do things together, like produce confessions of faith and respond to challenges to their tradition and their beliefs. So congregational polity, but associational cooperation. Church and state, religious liberty, I think we're the best of the best. And others of you may want to talk about this more extensively along the way. It's one of the things I really love about being a Baptist. You have to believe in the religious liberty of the person with whom you disagree most vehemently. And if you can do that, you understand what it means to be a Baptist. We have freedom of religion. And I think that freedom rests in Christ. Galatians 5:1, for freedom Christ has set you free, me free. And I really do rely upon that. And the logical consequence of separation of church and state. A few other things that developed along the way. The modern mission movement began with the Baptists. There were no missionary societies until the Baptists came along. William Carey led the way, and in October 2nd, 1792, the Baptist Missionary Society was founded. It's a real long name, and I won't get into that at this particular time. And we established societies for education, anti-slavery, publications. We found ways of doing things together. And I think that was one of our strengths. So that's the kind of an overview of interpretations of where Baptists began, and kind of a quick view of where we began in England. And next time I'll talk about Baptists in the Americas. So do you have any comments, questions you want to throw in there? And if you have some comments, it'd really be appreciated. True, false? Anything? Yes, Carla.
Carla has a question.
So
Yes.
you are an enthusiastic encyclopedia of Baptist information, and I love it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
You get an A for the day.
Yeah.
These others are C+ right now.
By any chance, have you been reading from notes that you could share willingly and happily with us?
I could do that, but reading from Jeremy, you may be looking to have your ordination recognized. And I was going to write to you about that, Jeremy, and I lost the email and I never got around to it, but I was going to write you. If you're interested in doing that, one of the things you have to do is take the course in American Baptist history and polity, or polity and history. And I think, Liliana, don't you teach that? I'm glad to have a co-worker on that. Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? It is fun. But I can share any notes that I have and will along the way. But here's the deal that you get that only 2 other people in the history of American Baptist life have gotten from me. I waived the tuition for my fellow church members. So when you get into that process, you write to Steve Bills and say what you want to do, and then we can do it, and we can do it online on that. And it's a continued learning process. But I have a passion for Baptist history. And there is nothing I would rather want to be when we at our best. And like I said, we smell up the place sometimes, but I love the idea of Baptist freedom at all levels. I think it opens the possibilities for Baptists to be relevant as the world changes about them. And I think Grant Park Baptist Church is a good example of that, as any church that I know of, Jeremy. You are fortunate to be here, my friend. So, yeah. And that's my honest, unbiased opinion, of course. But yes, I am enthusiastic, and yes, I could share this information and send you the material that I probably would in that course. But I'll be glad to do it ahead of time. And anyone else, SlaydenA@gmail.com. So get me your email address by doing that. And if you forget it, Jeremy can get it for you. David.
So I want to second one thing that Carla said. I'll use a different word. And sometimes this word is heard as a put down, but I don't mean it that way at all. You're very entertaining.
I think that's the way it ought to be. I try to be that in preaching, and the people like the jokes better than they do the sermon. So, but
well, and sometimes I've heard folks describe someone as entertaining as kind of a put down because yeah, it's entertaining, but it's superficial. But that's not at all what I mean. Yeah. It's a lot of fun to listen to you. I know a lot of this stuff and I've taught some of it, but it's a lot of fun to listen to you. I have a couple of comments and a question. The comments are brief. First of all, I know that I'm not the only one who was thinking this. Carol and I interchanged a text message, rather a chat privately, but Liliana and Horacio may have been thinking this too. You talked about the Mennonites, and you said that there wasn't a direct historical connection from Mennonites to Baptists, but there are, as we all know, a lot of theological and practical connections. And so the American Baptist Seminary of the West, now operating under its new name, Berkeley School of Theology, a couple of years ago called a Mennonite president.
Yeah. I would say they're my spiritual cousins. You know, I mean, I think we have a lot in common. We studied the same book and came up to a lot of the same conclusions. And they were a good source of a left-wing reforming movement that the Baptists could learn from, and they did learn from. And I think as far as the historical connection, it's kind of a spiritual connection more than historical, because there's no Baptist church that came directly out of another.
That's what
an Anabaptist church.
That's what I took you to mean. Let me say a couple of other things real quickly. And it sounded like Liliana wanted to have a word. You talked about the persecution that came to the English Baptists under King James. And I find that so ironic because Baptists in the Americas, at least, probably Britain as well, but I don't know, adopted the King James Bible wholesale. And to this day, there are Baptists that consider the King James the only real English Bible. You drive around the South and you see signs that say things like independent, fundamental, King James only. So I just thought that was really ironic. So here's my question. And you touched on this briefly, but I'd like to hear you maybe elaborate on it a little more. You talked about one of the pioneers, and I didn't keep all the names straight, the gentleman who went to the Netherlands and witnessed baptism by immersion.
Richard Blunt.
Yeah.
Blunt.
So what was the rationale, his rationale and that of other early Baptists for moving from the pouring to the immersion?
I think they would, I can't document this, but I think that they would read the story of the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan River. And, I think that would have been the example for what they did in terms of adopting baptism by immersion and then the symbolic nature of it. But, that's my.
A lot of the Renaissance art illustrates that event by having Jesus and John standing in the Jordan waist deep, and John is pouring water on Jesus. When I'm teaching theology, I've always connected it to Romans 6 and the very clear imagery that you alluded to in passing about the burial of the old self and the resurrection of the newness of life.
Right.
So anyway, those are some things very entertaining, very enlightening, and I could keep talking, but I've already had my say.
A few quick comments on that on the side. They don't mean a whole lot, but I did have I took some groups to Israel, several times, and I took some students over there. I jokingly said, what you need to do, finish your water bottle, fill it up, take it back and pour it in your baptistry. And some of them did. So sometimes they take you literally when they would. And I was interim pastor at Purdy, Missouri when I was teaching at Southwest Baptist. And I was there about 6 months. And there was this lady that sat on the front row, and boy, she followed me really closely. And when she got done, she said, you're a pretty good preacher, even if you don't use the real Bible. So I said, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, you use the King James, and I love it. I learned out of that to never condemn the King James, but to affirm those people who use it because that was their source for the word, and it was a good lesson for me. So, yeah. Oh, I'm pointing up here, but you don't know where you are. Yes, Horatio.
Well, thank you so much. It was so enlightening. Actually, I started my own reading after many, many years of, the course I took on Baptist polity and history back in seminary in the master's program. But it's so good to go back. I'm third generation Baptist. Back in Argentina, where we come from, it was we were colonized, because that's the way we feel, by the Southern Baptists. But I can't help but being thankful. However, the whole thing is that we was never taught. I was a church member of at least two. Basically 2 Baptist churches in Argentina, and never heard anything about history. It was recommended to me or to us that when we came to the United States to join a Southern Baptist church, but a week after I landed in the U.S., I happened to walk into the then First Baptist Church of Burlingame, California, that it's an American Baptist congregation that has been ever seen. My son is still there, went back. Actually, he wasn't even born when. But the thing is that the funny thing is, after all my theological training, after all my studies, and 2 degrees, 3 degrees, I can only call myself a Baptist doing theology. A Baptist doing theology, because when I think theologically. Some of these concerns are not that crucial. I was the first course in theology for us was liberation theology. Back then, back in the mid late 80s in Chicago, in Northern Baptist. Yes, of course, probably. I'm not. In fact, I see certain middle road, not middle road, but. Calvinistic, but at the same time Arminian, but it was not a major concern. So it was good for me to be clear, to have clarity about the difference between general Baptist and the general atonement and the particular atonement. Yeah. I always subscribe to the general. I think Christ died for everyone. In fact, we have in our small group at Grant Park, and most of the folks here are part of that group. We have talked about universal salvation, and at least we have a long conversation with David Wheeler, David Hunt, and Gary and Liliana and Carol and Carla. I mean, almost everybody here.
Yeah.
So, and that's because one of Jeremy's sermon. But never mind about that. I mean, going too far with that. But the thing is that it has been really, and I need to go back. And I admire Thomas Helwig. Yes, I reread what he meant, and the question of liberty of conscience, and that is significant.
Let me say one thing that I didn't get to, and I don't want to go too far on this, but I wrote a book on Southern Baptists right at the end of that controversy they had because I wanted to get a chapter on that. In fact, the revision should be out in a couple months on that. But one of the things that I concluded, and somewhat others may have said this, but I haven't found it yet, but I've come to the conclusion that theology is the result of faith. It's not the test of faith. And being the result of faith, as our faith grows, our theology grows. I've changed my views so many times along the way, and I believe that I was 100% correct at each stop on the journey. And I think God understands us. It takes us where we are. David, the theologian, you may scratch your head on that one. But I think that we express our faith in worship. We express our faith in theology. We express our faith in ethics. So theology is something that should be alive, and it can be alive as our faith grows and we have a better understanding and an application and understanding of the scriptures and where it gets on that. I wanted to say one other thing too, that another thing that I learned from these early English Baptists, they had diversity in their worship. John Smythe would not read from a translation, but he could read the languages, and so he would translate in his sermons, from the original languages. And so, but he would not allow translations. And also, they had a real problem when it came to singing and worship. In the early stages, they would have a male singer, no females in that, and that one person could sing from the Psalms, but nothing else. And they eventually wound up having some fights over it. I like to say, and for those of you who have been to worship service in Grant Park, every one of you are guilty of carnal formalities. I've seen it practice in our church, Jeremy. You got to do something about it. Carnal formalities with singing congregational hymns. That's what the term meant. And some of you engaged in promiscuous singing. And that's sad for a Baptist church. That's when men and women sing together. You don't know what it'll lead to. It might lead to holding hands if you're not careful. So anyway, but I look at that and I say, we figure out how to do things. And I think God blesses us for it. And he blesses our congregation in what we do and how we do it.
Slayden, next week next time when you talk about Baptists in America, I was laughing at those phrases that you just shared. Are you going to talk about alien immersion?
The alien immersion, yes. If ET gets converted, you put him under. That became my view a long time ago.
Sure.
I had that question on my ordination. Guy asked me, "What do you think about alien immersion?" Well, I'm still open to learning. That's what I told him, and I got out of it. It was a guy who was a landmark. That comes from that. The only valid immersion comes from a Baptist church. It does not come from Methodists. Some Methodists, they have immersion, but that's alien immersion. But from Kentucky, you know all about that. You may have been one of those aliens immersed. I don't know. So I guess it's 8 o'clock if people are wanting to quit. I go on this stuff forever and ever, but I do enjoy it. Our history is enjoyable. It's fascinating. We learn that these are people just like ourselves, figuring out who they are, where they are, and what they're doing. So,
hello, Esther.
And Slayden, Esther's hair's wet because we just baptized her.
You just
in the
baptized,
bathtub.
yeah. Did you
Is
hold
that
your
okay?
nose? If that
Say
elbow
hi.
flew, you got to do it again.
Hi, sweetie. How are you?
You're getting so big. My goodness.
Can I have a kiss goodnight?
Slayden, before we quit, when you were talking about the different deals on the Baptist or whatever, I was going back through my history of being a Southern Baptist, and the atonement, you know, the selection of all that. Well, I went through that at First Baptist Church in Dallas, where W.A. Criswell was a pastor.
Yeah.
You know, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
And then at Hyde Park Baptist Church in Austin on the baptism, Dr. Smith was very unique on his baptism, and I'd go through the deal with him when he did it. He said, "You're buried in Christ and risen to newness of life." And then when you went out of the baptistry, he says, and Jesus, when he's bad, he went up straightway out of the water, like that. And then and at the very end, he said, "And Jesus, we have done as you have commanded, and yet there's room for more." And do like, and raise his hands, and then the curtain would come down, and I'd be back there doing all that stuff, and all the way. I did that every time he did that. That was just so amusing to me. So I mean, yeah, that by 73 years and being a Baptist, you know, I've gone and I have grown through it and gone through different phases of it.
Yeah.
And so this was the history of it. Even if as my life, that brought back a lot of good memories of different phases of my life and different things that I did as a Baptist. So thank you.
I'll close with one other thing, Horatio. I used to say to my students, these were in my teaching days in Southern Baptist institutions, that that John the Baptist baptized at the south end of the Jordan River, and that makes Southern Baptist, you know, the true church. And I'd have these students write it down. I had to stop writing that down. They thought that was the real truth. You know, I thought it was a joke, but they weren't laughing. They were writing. So anyway, well, you've been a very good group of students tonight, and I'll look forward to a month from now. So
Thank you so